everybody. Good afternoon. I hope you're having a cool Sunday here in the Danbury area and elsewhere. Thank you for being here. My name is Cantor Penny Kessler. I'm the spiritual leader of the United Jewish Center, and so delighted that you are all here to join us today as we welcome Rabbi Felicia Sol and educator and poet Adam Sol to talk about this glorious poem written by Amanda Gorman. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge some people. First of all, Lisi Marcus is here. She is the president of the United Jewish Center. And thanks to Lisi and the board of directors for making this possible. Thank you also to Howard Russick, who is the chairperson of our continuing ed program, and a special thank you to Susan Frank for all the work that she did in helping coordinate and organize today. And a behind the scenes thank you to Neil Friedman. He is our Zoom guru for this afternoon, and he is going to be helping guide us. Lisi, before I introduce you, just a word to everybody for some logistics. As you came in, you were muted. And that is so that we can have an organized and calm and wonderfully efficient and welcoming afternoon. If you have any questions, if you have comments that you would like to offer to Rabbi Sol and to Adam Sol, please put them into the chat. And we will be going through the chat on a regular basis. And if you have questions, when they offer some time for questions, we'll be able to ask them on your behalf. And if you're not able to do that, please know that as we get towards the end of the presentation today, we'll invite you to raise your hand and ask your questions then if they haven't been answered already. So that being said, I'm going to turn this over to the UJC president, Lisi Marcus.
Thank you, Cantor Kessler. I'm very excited about this program today. This came to me in one of my more cogent moments, and I said, gee, wouldn't this be really neat? I think that most of us probably witnessed Amanda Gorman reciting this beautiful poem at the inauguration. And what a better way to have a discussion and dissection of it, but from hometown grown, very accomplished now adults. And I'm so pleased to welcome Rabbi Sol, and is it Professor Dr. whatever you want to call him, Adam Sol. As Felicia mentioned, we go way back to, let's see, I don't think I was married. It had to be more than 30 years ago. When Felicia was in high school and she was the president of the Stephen Wise Club and I was the advisor. And I did get a chance to work with her a lot and knew that she was set out for greatness. Adam, I didn't know as well. He was already on his college journey at that point. But I certainly have worked with both Rich and Roberta through the years, and we are so pleased to have you both here. A little background. That Adam actually has a BA, an MFA, a PhD, and Felicia has a BA, Master's in Jewish Education and Master's in Hebrew Letters. The title of this program, and I'm not sure that I am alone in this because many of us had to look up this wonderful word, poetry, exegesis, and imagining a better world. And I'm sure that Felicia and Adam will explain that to us in more depth. The hill we climb has powerful imagery, poetry, and Jewish spiritual connection. And those words could, in due time, bring us to a better world. Adam describes himself as a poet, writer, and teacher. He is the coordinator of the Creative Expression and Society program at the University of Toronto's Victoria College. He's published a book of essays and will have his 5th book of poetry available in fall, this coming fall, 2021. He and his wife, Yael Splansky, and 3 sons live in Toronto. And if I recall, Yael was one of Felicia's friends in Nefty at the time, and I do remember her from those days as well. And Adam, didn't you come and speak maybe after one of your first books of poetry many years ago?
I think I did, yeah.
I think so too. Felicia was ordained in 1999 from HUC Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. And since 2001, she served as rabbi at B'nai, how do you pronounce that?
B'nai Jeshurun.
Jeshurun, thank you, in New York City. Rabbi Sol is the first woman to serve as rabbi in this congregation in its almost 200-year history. She created the synagogue's family Shabbat prayer book and developed creative programming for members of all ages. She's received the 2005 Pacesetter Award, served on the board of Bend the Ark for 15 years, and is a member of the Rabbinic Council of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. Rabbi Sol and her son and daughter live in New York City and spend a fair amount of time in New Fairfield. Adam and Felicia grew up and were active in the UJC community, as we have alluded to. And I think they are also pleased to be back here today. Please welcome them, give them your attention, and I hope everybody enjoys this program.
Thank you, Lisi. It's just, yeah, it's a real pleasure for us to be back. I guess, you know, it's not physically back, but we're to be with this community that helped raise us, and both of us can trace sort of parallel but slightly different but connected roots all the way to UJC and to the time we spent running around in that basement and all the learning and fun that we had there. So it's a real pleasure to be able to come back and in whatever way and do a little teaching instead.
Yeah, I would just add that I think for both of us and for our family, which is still true for our parents, that the kind of the heartbeat of our Jewish life came from the United Jewish Center, and being growing up in a town that was not filled with many Jews, the UJC served really as the place where we sourced our Jewish life and family, and really set us on a path, along with obviously camp and youth group, but it was really the place we called home for our Jewish life. So we have a lot of great memories and feel blessed. I would say also just one other reflection, which I don't think I knew at the time growing up about UJC that was very unique, which was because it was a synagogue that served so many different towns and people. It was the only game in town for a really long time after its birth. It I think religiously set us up for having an ability to be at home in more than one setting in terms of religious life. It was Reform affiliated, but it had a traditional minyan. And so that's fairly rare in our time and in synagogues in general. And so I think even where I landed religiously was a part due to the fact that we had both a very kind of open and creative Reform experience, but also we're very grounded in traditional services and traditional rhythms. And I feel really grateful for the intersection of that that we experienced at the UJC. So it's great to be back and see so many familiar faces, and we're looking forward to, and Adam and I have never done something like this together. So it's a first for us to do something like this, and maybe we'll take the show on the road.
Yeah. I want to also give a shout out to Rhoda Molino, who was one of my first poetry mentors too. She, you know, of blessed memory, pulled me aside when she knew that that was an interest of mine and started, you know, feeding me Jewish poets that I still read to this day. So, these things, you know, all sort of trace back to those hallways. I think maybe we were planning on just starting with the, I mean, I imagine, I mean, everyone has seen it. Everyone, I think, on Earth has seen it by now, just about. But since we're going to be talking a little specifically about the text and about the poem, I thought it might be a really nice way to start to show it again to you, so we can all enjoy it again and also have it fresh in our minds as we go start digging in. Felice, do you have that called up, or should we use mine?
Use yours,
Okay.
the older one.
I will share my screen. Can everyone see that? Give me a thumbs up if you can see. Good. All right, here we go.
We can't hear it.
Adam, we can't hear it.
That's a problem. Oh, that's why. Maybe, how about now?
Ourselves, where can we find light
Now we
in
hear
this
it.
never-ending shade? The loss we carry a sea
I'm
we
going to
must
start it
wade.
again, so if you don't mind.
Mr. President,
There we go.
Dr. Biden, Madam Vice President, Mr. Emhoff, Americans, and the world. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. And the norms and notions of what just is isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered, witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother, can dream of becoming president, only find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first. We must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promised glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared it at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens. But one thing is certain: if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the West. We will rise from the windswept Northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there was always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
All right.
You'll start. So you're gonna go first, right?
Oh, I'm gonna, oh shit. Okay, good. So yeah, I have I mean, the way I do this kind of teaching and the way we're trying to make this as much of a conversation as possible. So I have a few things I want to sort of get to when it comes to this poem and sort of this event. She was spectacular. To me, she stole the show. She was much more interesting than anything else. Even Lady Gaga, I think, even, although that one's probably the closest second. It's interesting, you know, 6 months later, how, you know, once you get into the actual, you know, what's the line is, you campaign with poetry and you govern in prose. And so now that, you know, that this new administration is trying to govern, it's a lot less full of these flights of inspiration, and it's much more in prose. But it's nice to come back to it all this time later and to revisit some of that you know, what inspires us. So this, to me, there are a couple of things about the poem that I want to call your attention to, and then I'll hand it over to Felicia and she can sort of do the same. This, you know, from a stylistic standpoint, this fits into a lot of, into sort of a history of poetry that goes back and forth between spoken word and more traditional written forms, right? There are a lot of that kind of the performative aspects of that poem, which is part of what makes it so satisfying. And, you know, and if this were a different sort of class and I were teaching this in, you know, a history of American poetry class, I could pull those kinds of references. But I guess I'm more interested, so there's that. There's the kind of performative spoken word you know, traditions especially in Black writing in America, going back to Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks and all of those people. And we could spend some time there if you really wanted to. But I think for our purposes today, I'm more interested in talking about sort of the poetry of aspiration, right? Poetry that tries to get us to imagine what the country is capable of becoming. And for me, that, like, the origin of that is in Walt Whitman, but it's also, you know, we see it in the Emma Lazarus poem that is, you know, connected to the Statue of Liberty, give us your tired, your poor, and that kind of inspirational poetry, which blurs itself into religion, right? It sounds to us a lot like scripture, and I guess that's, I mean, maybe that'll be a good sort of chunk to start with, Felicia, and then you can take it from there, and we can start going back and forth about particular parts or whatever.
Yeah, I think just to kind of hone in on the difference between reading it and listening to it, and in some way, I think the listening was a religious listening, at least for those of us who needed it, right? That in some way it was a sermon, a good sermon on the Mount, if you want to call it, because of the desperation that at least a certain portion of our country needed to find the space to have an aspiration after so much pain in many ways. And so I think her, you know, reading it doesn't it's a powerful poem, but it doesn't mirror the experience of being lifted by it and how she performed it. And, you know, you called it the poetry of imagination. And I actually cited this professor a couple of weeks ago in a Devar Torah, but there's a retired theology professor, Dr. Walter Brueggemann, who's well known for biblical analysis, and he has this notion of the prophetic imagination, which is exactly, I think, the intersection about the poetry of aspiration, not the traditional prophet who is actually rebuking most of the time, but the fact that religious life is supposed to enable the possibility to see things as they ought to be rather than as they are. And I think through the poem, he releases, in a sense, a kind of wave of glory to entering into that kind of space after I think many of us felt beaten and battered. And I would say and she uses a lot of religious imagery in the poem. Besides citing a verse, she also plays with a lot of religious language, light and darkness. She plays with slavery and redemption. She plays with, the hierarchies of movement in terms of from low to high, which is also a very religious orientation. And so even as, as I was listening to it again, and I have the poem printed out, I feel like there are so many words that her use of them, you couldn't say, well, that's just English. That's just how we use them. But as someone who's deeply embedded in religious life and religious language, to me, it's like pregnant with so much meaning religiously, in the same way, I think for you, Adam, that the poetry does that for you.
For sure. And I mean, there are all sorts of these references, you're catching the religious references and the texture, the biblical references. And I'm also hearing like Maya Angelou's inauguration poem for Bill Clinton. And I think she was even wearing a ring. The ring was a reference, had a caged bird in it. The clip that I showed didn't have a great image of it, but that's Maya Angelou's most famous book is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. So I think there was a deliberate shout out there. There's a reference to Hamilton that most people caught about history having its eyes on us. One thing getting ready for this, I also noticed was the Jonah references, right? Being in the belly of the beast and working your way out, which I also, I'm not sure, I'm looking at this crowd and I'm guessing that most of you are big Kendrick Lamar fans. the rap artist who won a Pulitzer Prize a couple years ago. Kendrick Lamar also apparently has, not apparently, he does. He has in one of on the album that he won the Pulitzer for, has a kind of storytelling where a character is sort of connected to Jonah. So some of the Jonah may actually be also a reference to hip hop, which is a nice parallel connection. I saw a question in the chat before I don't want it to get away from me, about her hand movements and about, I guess, calling attention to the performative aspects of it. I think in the same way that, you know, you don't get the full experience of opera if you're only hearing it on CD. You know, if you don't get to see the sets and you don't get to see the costumes and the acting too, I think, you know, it's fair to say that poetry in this style is, you know, created to be delivered. And so when it's on the page, you're not getting the full experience. You get an experience, and it's a satisfying one. And one of the first questions I got as a sort of poetry prof, I had from my students, they said, "Oh, you know, do you think the poem holds up?" And my answer was, "What do you mean? You know, wasn't it the best thing you saw that day? It seemed like it held up fine to me." And they meant, does it hold up on the page? And to me, that's irrelevant. I mean, it works on the page, but in the same way that, you know, look, if Bob Dylan can win the Nobel Prize, then this certainly works. It holds up. And I think are trying to understand it, you know, in its own genre, right, in its own form, I think. And obviously her hand motions, you know, which are visual cues to let us see the verbal play she's doing, right there. It's giving us a little bit more help to sort of hear those things that she's calling our attention to, those clever, you know, the word play, the kind of small reversals that she does in language that you know, she sets us up there, you know, that she sets them up as opposites so we can see them at work.
I think also the sense of movement that she gives, right? Mm-hmm. Like even there are cues, the essence of the poem is to say things can change and they're going to get better, at least according to some of us, right? So that her sense of movement is expressed in the physicalness of her expression of it, and I think many of us experience that sense of possibility with her language, you know, and feeling, you know, I think that's what good religious poetry does, or a sermon, or something of spoken word. It feels like it transforms or takes you with it. And I think part of the performative nature of it did just that. We talked a lot. Lacey asked if we talked about it a little before today. We did a little bit. We had a phone call on Friday. So, I mean, you know, I think for me that, and just in terms of the recitation of it, it really has to also speak to who's the audience in a sense. Also, because I don't know in terms of who's on this call, but for those of us who felt quite depleted and enraged over the prior 4 years of who our country was and who we were, which is articulated in the poem, she also speaks to a larger picture of redemption that is not necessarily a partisan version of redemption. Redemption is not partisan in the sense, right? The language of redemption is towards an end. It's modeled off of a previous redemption, which is in the leitmotif of the biblical story. Redemption is, of course, the Exodus from Egypt, in which, you know, and she references the seas to cross. She references slavery, obviously, as it relates to the United States. But I think putting out a vision of redemption that is indisputable in a certain sense, because everyone fits into that story. And so I think also you could see she was playing both with the brokenness of what was true for those who have felt that the prior years were totally traumatic and tragic, and at the same time trying to put forth a vision of redemption that was inclusive of all, and that didn't speak to that that essentially polarization that is still obviously existing in our country in a very deep way. And I think that's a tricky line to hold, and given the moment that she was living in the same way also, I think that President Biden tried to do that in his speech, probably less successfully than she was able to do, because she was doing it in poetry and he was doing it in prose.
I think, Felicia, it's fair. We should back up, because I feel like we're making assumptions about our audience here. First off, I apologize for making assumptions about your knowledge of hip hop. And second of all, I want Felicia to be aware that she's making assumptions about whether or not you were actually participating on January 6th or on January 21st. So I apologize for making those broad assumptions about this audience, but I think we're going to continue, working with that. If any of you are under indictment, for federal crimes on January 6th, we apologize. We're not exactly talking to you today, but we hope you're still responding to our exegesis here. I think, it's fair to say that she could avoid that as much as possible. She could try to stay as clear of those political issues as possible, but she also wasn't going to shy away from them, right? Even just the fact that she, a young Black woman was delivering this poem in that context is itself a statement that certain members of that audience wouldn't respond positively to. But because the audience is so broad, the audience, is certainly all of the United States. And in that way, I think, she's got to toe that line between, the populist voice, a popular voice, something that can be easily accessible, that leans towards hip hop or spoken word over more, traditional literary forms. And also to give, geeks like me enough to sort of enjoy some of that intertextual references that is sort of the trademark of those more more, they're not literary form, they're no more traditional actually, but they're more traditionally associated with texts, with written literature. So anyway, I just want to, she's doing a lot of that balancing work, and I think that's really interesting, and I think she does it very well. Between the popular and the literary, between the broad and the specific, between the forward-looking and the acknowledging the past.
Good. You're the one for the literary references, but also just, you mentioned Maya Angelou before, who has this poem, about I rise, and it's in the singular. It's a very really strong poem. And the fact that she uses the we here in contrast to the I of Maya Angelou, I think also is really powerful, because she's in a moment where her job is a sense like to get a we, right? Mm-hmm. Like this is a we moment, not an I moment. And so she has to plug into that sense of collectivity and painting a picture for the collective that people can find themselves in. And I think that's also part of religious life. And there are a lot of images, that she speaks to about the, plurality and unity, which is, I think, also something, at least the Jewish tradition, and more particularly, I think, the Hasidic tradition, but is to try to understand the very unique purpose of one individual in the context of the larger whole. Our experiences, like the Sinai narrative of receiving the Torah, is played out really profoundly in that way, that everyone receives Torah according to their own unique needs, but as a collective, we are the whole of the Torah. And if one person is missing from the Torah and doesn't isn't able to stand for who they are, then the Torah itself is not complete. So I think there are a lot of ways that the uniqueness of an individual plays into a collective story that religious life also has to balance in order for people to feel a sense of agency and purpose in their own selves, while also being a part of something larger and figuring out how to hold one's particular uniqueness in the context of a larger covenant, in a sense, you could say, which is also religious language of covenant rather than contract. And that, I think she was trying to inspire the notion of covenant again in America, when many of us felt like the covenant or the promise had been broken. And I think that that's also a really powerful, you have to have an imagination. You have to be able to give people the bone, in a sense, to be able to say, yes, I want that. Because I think for so long, when you've been so depleted and so dejected after the America, at least that I felt like I was living in, takes a lot to kind of bring you out from that low place, to say even aspiration and imagination is possible after having been so bruised. And I think that's also a very religious structure of, and there are many Psalms that speak about, you crying in the evening and waking to joy in the morning, or those that sow in tears will reap in joy. The sense that we purpose our pain towards a redemptive end. There's another notion, Yirida Letzorach Aliyah, to go down in order to go up, based in many ways on the story of Yosef, of Joseph's story, because he goes in the pit and then he rises up. And in a sense, I think she tries to cultivate that the bruises actually, and the hurt, that section where she says, that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried. Those I think are very religious in a sense. It's not, we can't kind of put it aside, the pain. We have to use the pain to find another way. And I think that also was an important aspect of this. Like, what we have felt over these years has to be transformed, and that's what part of religious life is meant to do, I think.
I'll call attention to a slightly different part, just to talk about perfection. One of the sort of prose source texts here is the preamble to the Constitution, right? That in order to form a more perfect union. And so that's actually one that she twists a little. It's near the bottom. If you have the text in front of you, it's near the bottom of the first page. And yet we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form, that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge a union with purpose, right? And so I think the idea of some perfect union was always a myth, right? Even in the Constitution, even the preamble to the Constitution, it's in order to form a more perfect union, not and that's always asymptotic, right? There's my mother, the math teacher, is happy I use the math term, right? It's asymptotic. It's always going to be a little bit out of reach. We're never going to quite get to it. But the idea that we are striving to get closer and closer to it, again, like you have to hash that out in Leviticus. You have to hash it out in prose, but the impetus to go after that, is poetic, and that she's trying to that we are striving to forge a union with purpose, I think, is an interesting turn on that sort of source text.
Which is also, again, a leitmotif of the religious tradition, which is you never actually, that the 5 books of the Torah end with them not arriving in the promised land, that there's, Moshe doesn't get to go to the land of Israel, even though he's carried them through the wilderness, that there's a sense of not having, there is that previous redemption that we had once, but it's not actually, there isn't a sense that we're going to get it. Again, it's that we have it as our, the Jewish version of the North Star in a sense. And yet at the same time, I think the other piece I think that I would call to it, she says, well, but while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. And this playing that there is a meant to be underneath it all. There is the sense that there is a promised land, even if we're never going to get there. And in a sense, there's this beautiful teaching in the Jewish tradition about the fact we don't actually thank God with a liturgical notion about the miracles on Passover like we do for Hanukkah and Purim when we say the prayer called Al Hanisim, upon the miracles. And the question is asked, well, why not? Of course, the whole redemption story is a miraculous story. There's the splitting of the sea, all these things. And one of the answers given is because redemption is built into the universe. In a sense, it's already been imagined, and therefore we have to unfold it and move towards it, but it's not a miracle in and of itself. And I love that idea, which is like, there is something that we know to be true, even if that perfect union is not going to come, but that we have a sense of driving purposefully towards something that's built in. And I think this is also something that America is wrestling with in general, right? About who are we, that beautiful image that we talk about of, the pursuit of happiness, like that everyone is equal, when we know it was written under circumstances that were completely against that idea, given that that was only for white male landowners. Yet there's something that drives us towards something more deeply purposeful underneath that specific language from that origin story, which is, I think, something that America is wrestling with in general. I don't know how you feel about as a Canadian these days, but.
Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, the notion that the United States still has of itself as a beacon for the world has, taken a few hits over the last little while. We could argue that it was never quite as much of a beacon for the world as it likes to think of itself. And having lived in Canada for a while, I can sort of feel that more than I used to. But nevertheless, it still does. I think the idea of the ideal America is still very powerful around the world, even if the actual America doesn't fulfill that either. And so that, if we can strive to be it, right? If we're brave enough to see it, even if we're brave enough to be it. I mean, to me, that even, the reference in that last line too is, the land of the free and the home of the brave is like, blue collar American patriotism as possible. She's going to summon that, so that even, the blue state people, Americans can sort of feel that connection to what they hope America is supposed to be. And I think, that's quite powerful. And there, that's why we're still talking about it 6 months later.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm getting a question. I don't know if everyone's seeing them, but if you want to go in, we can deep dive into some of the sort of the poetry specifically. I'm getting a question from Julie, but I don't think the whole group can see it. How she's doing internal rhyme, or I mean, like, I'm happy to point out some of that. I want to leave it, I don't want to take it too far away from people. If, maybe Julie and I can have a conversation about that one separately too.
Why don't you share a little bit? You're here for a reason.
Yeah, right. I guess I am. I thought I was just here because I was.
About me.
To me, that's one of these sort of the internal rhyme, and it's not a rhyming poem. It's not a metrical poem in a standard sense. It doesn't use regular rhythms. It doesn't use regular meter or rhyme, but it does a lot of internal rhyme and a lot of play on those kinds of rhymes. Even, you catch them along the way, and then you hear them again. They echo later on. I'm trying to find one yeah. So right at the beginning, there's the where can we find light in this never-ending shade, the loss we carry, the sea we must wade. So you've got these aids, and you can hear that one feels a little stiff, right? A little forced. But what she's doing is she's planting a sort of oral with an AU, oral seed, that she's going to refer to later on. It's on my second page. I think we're all working with the same text here. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in the bridges we've made. That is the promise to glade, which I don't think is actually a word. The hill we climb. So suddenly, and there's the title of the poem, right? So the aid from the shade and the sea we must wade suddenly returns with the hopefulness or the challenge of the victory that won't lie in the blade and the bridges that we've made, right? So like even if you've got sort of the leitmotif, I mean, the musical analogy is probably the most appropriate. You get this little line of melody or a little rhyme of melody at the beginning there, and then it returns, and it kind of reminds us about the kind of struggles to achieve these kinds of things, to achieve the ideal society that she's talking about. Julie, was that a little taste? I mean, to me, the internal rhyme, and this is something, frankly, that spoken word poetry, that oral forms do much better than textual forms tend to do. On the page, those kinds of internal rhymes, first off, you forget them. They're not in your ear as clearly. You don't remember them in your ear when you're a page and a half later, the way you do when it's in your human ear, when in the sound of it. And second of all, that's just a technique that spoken word poetry uses really effectively and focuses on, right? It's the oral aspect of it, with an O in that case. So anyway, I think she does a lot of that. It's quite good. I think, people who are experts in spoken word poetry would say she could have done more, in the same way that like true hip hop artists really, are dismissive of Hamilton. But for those of us who are not hip hop experts, Hamilton sounds fantastic. And for Broadway people might say, okay, there's some tunes that are, a little creaky in Hamilton, but for the people who are coming from hip hop, it really works for them too. So, the staging isn't as spectacular as other Broadway shows, but that, who cares? It sort of comes in the middle that way. And I think this poem does that too, that it's sort of in between a spoken word tradition and a sort of high art literary textual tradition, and doing some of the work of both.
And Ellen Metzger, who is also a BJ member and is in Richfield, says, it comes out in the end too with shade, aflame, and unafraid.
Yeah, exactly.
So Neil Marcus wrote in the 9th stanza that begins, "Scripture tells us," do you see an interesting double entendre where the poet refers to victory as laying down arms and building infrastructure, something that has been in the forefront of the current Biden administration. The conclusion of this stanza refers to the repairing of the past, decaying infrastructures. I don't know that she was that deep into policy in the sense, like, I don't know that she saw that as her my sense is probably her infrastructure is a wider version of infrastructure, about kind of the repair of the brokenness of the systems that have set up the country, that particularly as a young Black woman, probably is, the systematic and structural racism that exists, and in a sense the country was built on, which hopefully are decaying. So I don't know that she meant to use it as a political policy orientation, but I think her sense of frayed infrastructures and decayed, where the bridges are. I mean, the bridges as a metaphor for recognizing that, on the one hand, we have to get from here to there, and that is a very true aspect of the reality of our country, the needs for infrastructure rebuild, and at the same time, there hasn't been enough bridge building, right? And in a sense, the foundational kind of things that held the country up are actually decaying in many ways before our eyes. The assumptions, it goes back to what Adam was saying earlier about what the America was meant to be and what the truth is of our beginning. So I think the infrastructure is a very layered orientation. And I mean, interestingly enough, right, even that conversation about the kind of the origin story and the infrastructure of our country around systems and structures is a battle that's taking place in the country. So how do we kind of wrestle with, in many ways, the kind of the work that we need to do to deal with those structures and systems, while also not being embattled as a country, which is not going to get us anywhere. Which is, I think, one of the challenges of our time. How do you address, and she uses the word repair, which in our tradition is tikkun, like how do you heal those things which are not, there are actually texts in our tradition about, and are used around thinking about reparations, around when the infrastructure of a house is built on a faulty structure, and how do you deal with that? And so in a very halachic way, in a very legal way, those are being addressed. So I think that's a really interesting question.
It's interesting to me too, the joke about that I started with, that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. The truth is that both religion and or at least our religion and poetry too, both have tools for working with the details too, right? It's a different tone, and poetry can shift itself to other kinds of modes when it wants to get into the nitty-gritty details and tell individual stories and reflect on individual experience. And Jewish tradition certainly has the tools to deal with, to work in prose also, to work with the nitty-gritty details too. So I don't want to, disparage the capabilities of poetry and religion to sort of turn and sort of address these kinds of specifics too. But in this poem, I mean, we're really just, it's an inauguration poem. So really it's about setting your sights on what's possible. By 6 months into the administration, maybe they need different kinds of poems to help the bureaucrats keep going.
I think it's an interesting aspect of the Jewish tradition, where the Torah is written primarily in prose, and yet and this is addressing the word exegesis, which my mom said she had to look up. Exegesis is how do you analyze the text, and the practice that we have as a tradition to analyze the text, for me, is poetic, right? Because it tries to move the sense of the flatness or the unknown, or the picking apart of the text, to actually give it more imagination to answer some of the aspects of the things that don't line up, that the rabbinic tradition doesn't like when things don't agree in the Bible. It is problematic for them. But in a sense, I think having an interpretive tradition is by design poetic, to sustain an ongoing imagination that things aren't only what's written on the page, that reality isn't only how we see it, but that beneath it and above it, and if you pick it apart, it births something new. And I think that is, you know, in a sense, the project that we're doing now, which is looking at this poem in a much more kind of pulling it apart kind of way, then opens up, right, new stories, which is exactly the aspect of our tradition that I would say I find most compelling, right? Because one story leads to many, many more stories that lead to, you know, layers and layers of uncovering. It's like an archaeological dig in the sense of birthing an imagination.
Right, and for me, if you call that action poetic, and for me, that action is holy.
Right.
So
right.
that's the aspect of study, you know, that kind of engaging with text, you know, bringing your own sensibility to a tradition, you know, which is what she's doing and what we're doing with all of us today. Like, to me, this is sort of a kind of holy work, religious work, that by engaging with a text that we are moved by, that we are inspired by, and sort of working out exactly what that means, you know, what it means, what inspired for what, inspired how did she do this? I think, to me, that's a kind of religious work as well.
Right. Exegesis sounds very, it's much more of a technical term, but I think in our tradition, that is the holy work. Like, that's why actually, we're having Professor Moshe Habertal speak to our community on Thursday. He's a professor of law and ethics in Israel at the Hartman Institute. He has a book called The Meaning of the Canon, or The People of the Book, The Meaning of the Canon. And in his opening section in the book, he speaks about the fact that the Jewish tradition doesn't have theological consistency. It's consistently lies going back because we continually going back to the text, right? That we don't have to have one version of God, because we just keep working through the text, and that, in a sense, provides the returning always to the text is the vehicle by which we have holy discourse, but it's not to reduce anything to one uniform version of things. And I love that idea, which is the enterprise is actually the holiness of where we see ourselves together in it, even though our versions of the story, or what speaks to us particularly, even our own version of God, doesn't have to be consistent. There are many theologies in Judaism, and we're not asked to sign up for one particular dogma. In fact, there's very little in a sense. I mean, there is dogma in communities, local communities, but in a sense, the enterprise is a much more kind of weaving through an ongoing return to text, which is holy, and that's what our tradition deems holy. Any last questions? And we learned everything that we spoke about today at the United Jewish Center.
It's true. Absolutely true.
Yeah. Will you be sending out a recording?
We're not in charge of the recording.
Yeah, we can make the recording available if you email to treasurer@unitedjewishcenter.org.
Neil,
Yes.
it's Ken Kessler. Would you be able to spotlight Lisi and myself again?
Sure.
And perhaps Howard Russick and Susan Frank. Lots of people. Great, thank you.
Howard and Susan. Okay.
Yeah, Howard Russick. And there he is, or there he isn't. He's somewhere in there. And Susan, great, thank you. So Yes, Brenna, we will be offering the link for the recording as soon as it is created and vetted by Rabbi and Professor Sol. They're going to get
And we
first
can
crack.
trim out all the dumb stuff we said. He'll trim out
Uh,
everything I said, and I'll trim out everything she said. The recording will be about 30 seconds long.
That sounds good. So, before we close up, I want to acknowledge everybody whose efforts went into this. From the United Jewish Center, Howard Russick, who is the chair of our Continuing Education Committee, Susan Frank, who is a member of that committee, Rhoda Guider, who is not spotlighted, but that's okay. She and Howard work regularly and meet regularly to develop programming and all sorts of wonderful things that we have been able to take advantage of. It's also important to note that this program was sponsored by the Robert S. Young Fund, which brings educational, musical, artistic, theatrical programmings not only to the United Jewish Center, but also to the community. And it is such a blessing to see so many people here from the outside community. Neil, thank you very, very much. Thank you for sending that. In the chat, Neil has put his email address. Once it gets vetted and it gets cleaned up. So thank you so very, very much. And Lisi, I'm going to turn to you to say thank you to our guests. What a fantastic presentation. Absolutely remarkable that you can take a 6-minute plus piece of poetry and dive so deeply into it. So Lisi, I turn to you.
I think it was terrific, and my husband is like nudging me here. He wants to say something.
I have to cut her off for the moment, but I have to say that this poem, this little 6-minute poem, is an incredible statement of where we are in this country, as our speakers have both indicated. When you think about it's a young woman of color, young, I mean, 22 years old. It has youth, it has all the racial issues before us. And it talks, of course, of as you say, scriptural and biblical images, but it talks so much about politics. A poet. I mean, think about how many poets have really talked, and again, our speakers could tell us this at another time, how many poets have really talked about politics, as this poem talks about politics and interweaves it with history. I tell you that the more I hear this, the more I read this, the more I think about it, I realize that it really is a landmark in our analysis of current poetry. And I think I'd like to personally thank our two speakers for their analysis of this, and tell them that they certainly didn't fall on the deaf ears in this household. Now I can give my lead here back. And by the way, my image of God did come at the United Jewish Center years ago. I thought God was a guy with big ears, but I realized that God could also be a little blonde lady. They're all at the UJC. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Sorry about that. Had to indulge him. But as Neil said, it was a wonderful interpretation. Your wisdom, your views and perspective, I think, helped us all see this from a different vantage point. And I know that I will be rereading it and listening to it again and thinking of some of the things you said when I do that again. So thank you. We will be making a small honorarium to a nonprofit charity, something close to each of you. We have to get that information from you as a thank you for today, for your time and effort and your dedication and commitment to your own crafts. And from the UJC, our thanks and appreciation to Toda Rabah.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.